Hello everyone, hope you're well. Today I want to share some quick tips about how to make your fast moving pyro emitters smoother. If you're a beginner and have attempted something like a fireball effect or a fast moving torch, you've probably ended up with an effect that looks something like this. And upon looking up, you probably came across a forum response saying you need to add more substeps, which depending on your situation is not always the solution. So, without further ado, let's get into it and I'll show you some ways how to alleviate this. As you can see on screen right now, we have a very fast moving pyro simulation and it has a lot of stepping because of how fast it's moving, even though the substeps are maxed out at 10. As you can see here, if we go frame by frame, you can see almost every single solid frame of the sphere as it moves across, and it's not one smooth emission, which is what we're looking for. So the first method I want to use here, which is my favorite, is going to be the particle emission method, which we'll jump into now. Compared to brute forcing with substeps, which is a lot slower in my experience, using particles is faster and it allows for way more art direction. First of all, I'm going to drop down a sphere. This is going to be our object that we use to drive our movement. And then I'm going to drop down a transform. And I'm going to make this sphere just a little bit smaller, maybe half size, is 0.5 or 0.5. Then we're going to go ahead and animate it. So I'm going to alt click on translate. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on show handle. You can also move your sphere just through any of these, but I'm just going to do it by hand. And we're going to go about, let's say, 15 frames. And we're going to move this sphere just over here. And we're going to alt-click translate again. And we're going to have a look. Before I press play, I am going to tick real-time toggle. And this is just going to make sure that when I press play, it's not zooming by as fast as it can. And it actually goes by at the frame rate specified in our timeline settings. So I'm going to go ahead and press play. We see that's pretty fast, but we can get even faster. Substeps could probably handle something of that speed. And this is considerably fast. It doesn't look too fast on screen, but for Houdini, it's a pretty fast emitter. And there would be a lot of substepping here. So we're going to go over how to do particle emission for this kind of simulation. So I just made the sphere a little bit smaller and made it a little bit faster. However, everything else is the same. I haven't changed anything else. And I'm also going to cull some of these unnecessary frames. So I'm going to bring it from 240 to 30, just down here in the bottom right. And now we can have less dead frames. We could probably cut it down even more, but that's fine for now. So now we've got our object that's moving quickly, whether this be a plane engine or torch, or in this case, just a sphere. We are going to drop down a pop network. So just pop net, so that we can emit particles from this object. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the pop net. And if we press play, you're going to see that we have some suboptimal emission from our particles. And that's just fine. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, we have no gravity. So if we put down a gravity force and press play, we can see now that we have some kind of emission. So it is emitting as needed, but there's just no forces acting on it. And as we know, something that is at rest will stay at rest unless a force is exerted upon it. So these particles have no force exerted on them, so they are staying exactly as where they are spawned in space. So we're going to fix that. Just before we fix that though, we're going to fix our emission, because as you can see, we have the exact stepping problem that I was trying to prevent in the first place. So let's solve that. Particles are very lightweight to simulate in Houdini, depending on how many you have, and we don't have many here at all. So I'm going to go over to the pop solver, and up here we see the min substeps and max substeps are on 1. I'm going to go ahead and put those up to 5 each, and go ahead and press play, and it should still be pretty quick. Yeah, very quick. And now you can see we have a considerably smoother emission compared to when they were on 1 and it was just barely catching up with the ball. As you can see though, 5 is still not really sufficient. So I'm going to go ahead and increase that even further to about, just double it. Let's go to 10. It should still be pretty fast. And as you can see, it's a lot smoother now. However, we can see that these particles are staying way past their welcome, so we are going to get rid of those. The way we're going to do this is by cutting down their lifespan. So I'm going to go over to pop source, and I'm going to go over to birth, and over here on life expectancy under the birth tab, we can see it's set to 100. We're going to set this to 0.05 or just 0.5, and we're going to press play. And we can see that's still far too long. We're going to do 0.1, and we can see that's a little better. We might be like a 0.12, but yeah. 0.1 is fine. And now we can see we have it moving a lot smoother, and it's not leaving a super long trail behind it. One thing we are going to do is cut emission after the ball reaches its end point. So it should be here. I'm going to allow it one more frame, and I'm going to cut emission here. So we can see that we are using impulse activation as well as constant activation. I'm actually going to turn impulse activation off because we aren't using it really, it's actually set to 0. So constant activation is what we're going to focus on, and we're actually going to increase the point count as well. But first, let's turn it off after it lands. So after the ball gets here, I'm going to hit a keyframe. So I'm going to hit Alt, and I'm going to click on the constant activation. I'm going to go 1 frame over, make this 0, and I'm going to click Alt click again to set another keyframe to 0. And you can see now, if we go back, it's on 1. If we go forward, this is 0. So I go back and press play now. We can see that the particles stop emitting when they get to their destination. I'm going to go ahead and put this up to maybe just 10,000 particles and see how that looks. 10,000 particles is a lot better. It's still actually not as many as I would like. I might put it up to perhaps 50,000. Just so we can have a fuller emission. You can see there's some overlapping here, but that won't be a problem once we rasterize all these, which we see later. I also want to point out with the particle emission, but it doesn't matter too much in this example. If we go back to the source tab, we can change how the points are scattered. Right now, points are just being scattered directly onto the sphere that we have here. However, you could have it use all of the points exactly. So in this case, it would be every single like vertex point and emit during that. Or you could just use all points, which is not valid for this, or all geometry. And if you were to plug in a grid of points, for example, already, instead of the sphere itself, then you could use those points as well. For example, if you were to use a points from volume node like this, and set this to like 0, 1, you could use these points if you wanted to drive your simulation, although it would be a lot faster, because it'd be a lot slower, sorry, because it'd be using all of these points to spawn particles. We're going to delete that for now, just for this example, we don't need that. And I'm going to jump back into the pop net. So now we have our sphere emitting particles in a nice straight line as it moves laterally. Now we want to get a bit more interesting movement in our particles, so they're not just dead weight behind the simulation. And in fact, I might even increase the substeps of the simulation a little bit more. We can actually go over 10, even though it's the max. We can go, let's say, as far as 50, which sounds slow, but it's such a lightweight simulation, it's not a problem. And as you can see now, we are seeing even less of that stepping, so much so that you can barely tell that the spheres are, it's just one sphere placed after the other, basically, in increments. So, that's good. Now we're going to go ahead and add some pop force. You can add any kind of force you want in your simulation. You know, you'll do as you please. You might add wind, turbulence. I'm just going to add a pop force for this case, so it's not just a perfect straight line. Though it's on screen for such a short amount of time, it's actually not going to matter that much. So I'm going to drop down the pop force, and I'm going to go ahead and plug it into the middle here, which is the pre-solve. And if I press play, nothing is going to happen because we do not have it turned on, which I always thought was a strange Houdini setting to have the activation on 1, but the amplitude on 0, effectively rendering it off. But that is a concern I need to raise with my startup file. So I'm going to go ahead and place the amplitude to 1. Or set the amplitude to 1, and then press play. And we can see in this very small amount of time that's on frame, it's on screen, sorry, we can see that it is wiggling a little bit. You can increase this as crazy as you want. You can see we have like a little wiggle there for the small amount of time it's on screen. If I turn the turbulence up, you'll see that as well. And you could always add something like a pop wind if you wanted to blow it in a certain direction. Let's say I want to blow it up by 1, maybe up by 10. Let's try that. And then if I set the amplitude to this to like 5, turn the roughness up, which is the noise of the pop wind, then you can get something crazy like that. Let's turn the turbulence to 1 and maybe turn down the amplitude. Oh no, let's turn up the turbulence actually to like 4. Amplitude to 2. Let's see. So you could have something like that, for example. It's completely up to you how you have it, but that just adds some noise to the particles to add some visual interest. You could always have it as a straight line. Again, when we source pyro or smoke from these particles, it's going to have its own noise and disturbance and stuff we'll get into later. So don't worry too much about that right now. You can always come back and tweak it. It's pretty fast and lightweight, which is the benefit of this method. It's very easy to art direct. So I've gone ahead and set my turbulence to 3. I'm pretty happy with the way it looks as it zooms past like that. And I'm going to leave that as it is. So I'm going to delete the pop force because I didn't use it in this case. And I'm going to use the pop wind. But again, use whatever you like. So after we're happy with our particle simulation, I'm going to jump back up to our geometry level. And I'm actually going to rename our sphere here Pyro Setup. Just good habit to name your geo nodes, even if you're using one. And now after that, we are done with our popnet. We can see we press play, we've got our simulation. If this was a heavier simulation, you know, you can just file cache it. It's super lightweight, but it's a good habit. And especially if you have a much longer simulation than like 30 frames, it will do you well to cache it. So I'm going to drop down the file cache and I'm going to press save to disk. Just make sure it's on frame range there. And now with the display flag on that, we can preview that very fast, even though it was a very fast simulation in the first place. After this, I'm going to drop down a point velocity node, and that is just going to calculate velocity on our points. So if I go ahead and display point trails, we can see that before the point velocity, they kind of just go wherever. They try and follow the noise of the particles, which is fine. We can use that. But if we use this point velocity, then we get a more broad left to right movement, which we can tweak later. But this is definitely a node you can, you know, disable. I will leave it enabled for now because, like I said, later we can tweak how much influence it has over our Pyro simulation. So I'm going to drop that down just so we have some velocities calculated. And then after this, I'm going to drop down a Pyro source node. What the Pyro source node is going to do is just allow us to add some attributes to our particles. I'm going to turn off my point trails so that when we put them into our Pyro solver, we can turn them into smoke and fire, essentially. Thankfully, the Pyro source has a initiate mode, which lets us add a couple of attributes automatically, which saves us time. So I'm going to go ahead and click initialize. I'm going to click source burn. I'll add burn and temperature, which are important for fire, of course, which we won't be focusing on here. And then I'm going to click initialize again, and then click source smoke, and that will give us most of the things we need for our for a basic Pyro simulation. So after this, we're going to drop down a volume rasterize attributes node. I'll go ahead and put my display flag on that. We're not going to see anything right now because, well, we're not rasterizing any attributes. What we're going to do with this node is take the attributes we created previously and turn them into a rasterized kind of volume so that we can source Pyro from them. So we go select our attributes. You can type them all out here if you want, like you can type burn and all that stuff and you'll see it sources it. But quicker than that is to click drop down and then select the ones you want. So we're going to select density, burn, velocity, and temperature. And that's what we are going to rasterize. Seeing as we're not focusing on flames this tutorial, we could very easily just source density and focus on the smoke. But that is a good set of attributes to bring in if you're going to be doing a Pyro simulation. But I do have much more in-depth videos about Pyro, specifically in Axiom. So if you're interested in those, you can check those out. I won't be going into too much more detail about it in this video. So now we've got that rasterized, we can see that it's not really representative of our particles that we had beforehand. It's this big chunk. We're going to have to change some settings in order to get that down. So the main one, we're going to have to, two of the main ones are voxel size and particle scale. So if we change voxel size to 0.5, you'll see that it's still a really big lump of volume. It's just a huge volume lump. What we can do to fix this is actually come to our particle scale, and if we bring this down, we'll see that it starts conforming to the particles we had underneath that. If we go ahead and put the template tag on our Pyro source, we're going to see the particles underneath. It's actually hard to see now, so what we're going to do is just decrease our particle scale a little bit more. And we're going to decrease our voxel size along with it until we can get an emitter that is mostly representative of the shape that we had underneath. So I'm just going to tweak these a little bit more, maybe 0.1. Okay, we can work with that. Again, you can always come back and tweak this. It's a very customizable workflow. So after that's done, I like to, again, cache the rasterization because depending on the simulation, it can be really heavy, especially if you've gone really small with those voxel size like 0.05 or 0.2 or 1. As you can see, that one is pretty slow. So it's a good idea to file cache that. Another setting on the volume rasterize that I neglected to mention is the velocity blur. The velocity blur, I typically don't like to enable with this setting because I like to have more control with the velocity, with the point velocity node. However, with another method I'll show you shortly, we will be visiting the velocity blur. As you can see, it blows out the shape that we've taken so much time to carefully art direct. So I'm going to leave that off and we will revisit this shortly. So after we've cached our volume rasterization attributes, I'm going to drop down a DOP network, and this is where we are going to put our Pyro simulation. So I'm going to name this Pyro sim, and we're going to jump inside of this. So you can see inside of our Pyro sim, there's nothing here because we didn't use a shelf tool, but it is a very easy setup. So we're going to drop down a Pyro solver. I'm going to use the default dense Pyro solver because the sparse one has not been giving me the look I wanted with the fast moving Pyro because of the lack of specific time step controls. So I'm going to be using this, but you can use the Pyro sparse solver exactly the same way. We're going to drop down a smoke object, and then we're going to drop down a volume source. And we're going to plug the volume source right into the sourcing, which is the last node there. So this is a very basic Pyro setup. I haven't got any gravity or anything like that, but it will do for now. So we press play. You're going to see absolutely nothing happen because we have not sourced our volume. So in our situation, in order to source our volume rasterized attributes, we can click first context geometry because our volume rasterized attributes is plugged into the first context, which is this node here. So we can do that. If you do not have it set up like this and your Pyro sim is out on the OBJ level and not inside your geometry, then you can just go ahead and click, you can go ahead and click SOP and then go and find it. Again, ours would be right here, and then you would source it like that. However, ours is the first context geometry, so we don't need to do that. Now we need to initialize smoke, so we don't have to add attributes ourselves. So we're going to do source smoke, and now we'll add all of the things for us, including temperature, even though it just says smoke. We press play, we will see that it is working. However, it goes directly outside of our bounding box. So we're going to go ahead and make this bounding box bigger. So I'm going to select our smoke object, and I'm going to come over here and click the show handle tool, and I'm simply just going to drag the box a bit wider and longer. We press play. We can see that we have that working now, although it'd be very low res. I'm just going to make a bit more space off the grid. We press play. We can now see we have some smoke emission. Let's make it a tiny bit longer. Now it is very low res, however, so we are going to focus on that now. So if we come over to the smoke object, we'll see the division size is 0.2. If we make that something like 0.02, which is smaller, we will see a much higher resolution simulation, which is exactly what we're looking for. So already with the default time steps on this, we can see that we go frame by frame. It does not have any gaps. You cannot see any noticeable spheres in the sourcing, and it carries the velocity over of our initial particles, which we sourced with the point velocity, which carries on into here because we brought the V in. So we press play. You can see it kind of mushrooms out at the end after it shoots forward, which may or may not be what you want. I'll show you how to turn that down. As you can see, we've got that sourced quite nicely, and this is with, again, minimal time steps. If we go to the Pyro solver and go to the advanced tab, you can also click open, use OpenCL here to use your graphics card. I would recommend doing this if you have a graphics card with 12 to 16 gigabytes of VRAM, depends on how heavy the simulation is. If you're lucky enough to have a card that ends in 90, you probably have 24 gigabytes of RAM, so like the 3090 Ti or the 50 series or 5090, 4090. Those normally have more RAM, VRAM, so you can do more with the CPU. If you're not sure, don't worry. Houdini will be sure to let you know when you run out of VRAM, so make sure to save before you try any heavy simulations with this. But it's great for just having a preview of small simulations like this. So if we go ahead and increase the substeps, let's say to 5, minimum and maximum, you'll see it is considerably slower. However, we get smoother emission, even smoother emission than last time. We get some nice billowy smoke, which you can, decide whether you like or not. So I'm going to leave this at 5 for now. And we are going to show you how to lower the velocity. I don't know who we is, it's just me. But I'm going to show you how to lower the velocity so that it doesn't overshoot, depending on if your particles are moving way too fast. So we're going to go over to the volume source, which is where we brought in all of our attributes, all the ones that matter for the smoke. And we are going to come down to V or vel, which is the velocity. V is just for particles, vel is for volumes. So we're going to go ahead and bring the source scale of that down. Right now, it's affecting it on a scale of 1. If we double that, you guessed it, it's going to double the influence of our velocity. So this smoke is going to shoot out the other end. It's going to go right outside of our bounds. It's going to mushroom a lot. You want some gunpowder kind of effect, something like that. Maybe that's what you're looking for, but we're going to lower that. So we're going to do 0.5, which is half of its original value, and press play and have a look at that. As we can see, it starts to mushroom a lot earlier, and it doesn't shoot all the way out, out of the bounds. We can do that even less. We do like 0.2. We can see that it peters out a lot earlier. This is actually where the particles stop emitting, and then it carries over way less. So it depends, what you're going for. But this is a bit more what I'm looking for, so I'm going to leave it at that. But as you can see, we have a smooth emission for a simulation that goes very fast. I'm going to go ahead and let that finish caching so we can just watch it back. But if we were to do this without the particles, as you can see on screen right now again, a little comparison, it is very choppy compared to this emission. And, you know, at the end, it kind of looks somewhat similar when the smoke comes up. But if you come at this point, you can very clearly see where the substep only method showing its flaws. So this is my favorite method. It's much faster than maximizing substeps, and it's also way more customizable, which is very important when you're trying to create a certain effect, especially with something as unpredictable as Pyro. There are a few things you do need to bear in mind with this, and I'll show you one example of it. So if you aren't making a fireball and you have something like a waving torch, you obviously have to consider the way that the particles would move before you source the Pyro on them. So if you wanted to have something like a torch, you don't want to just have your particles, you know, not moving. You need to give them some life before you can source your Pyro from them. So in this case, I just imagine if you had a torch, you could wave this around if you wanted to. It's just stationary. But all I've done to this is I've just added a pop wind, and you can see my settings here. I've made it go up 1.5, and I've made it move over on the Z 1. So that's all we've done here. I've given it amplitude of 1. I've made it a little rough, given it a bit of turbulence, just a bit of noise. And then when you source on this, then you'll have flames that make a bit more sense. Because if you just add a pop net to this, add no gravity, the particles aren't going to move like we saw earlier. So there is a bit more consideration in the setup for this method. But I do believe that tiny bit of preparation and thought is worth it for how much you can do with it. While I still have your attention, I do want to quickly just run you through some other options that might fit what you're doing. You know, the particle method is not the be all end all, and as with everything in Houdini, there are a million ways to do anything. So I'll show you a couple more ways to accomplish a smoother emission for fast moving pyro emitters. It's quite the mouthful. So as you can see on screen now, we have an example using the trail node, which is very similar to the particle method. However, it has a lot less customizability. But you're doing something like a fireball, a quick fireball, something like that. It might be, you know, just quick and dirty enough to get something done. I'm going to jump into this and show you how this works. It's very similar to the particle setup. You have your moving sphere, your emitter, moves very fast. And then you have your, let me turn the grid on, getting a bit lost here. And then you have a trail node after. So this setup before the trail node is identical. In fact, this whole setup is identical other than the trail node to our particle simulation. At this point, we put a pop net and source particles. But here we're using a trail node. So when you put this trail node down, it won't look like this by default. I'll put down another one. Just pop it in between there. You'll see it looks just like this. Which is a bit trippy. It's like an optical illusion. But that's because the trail length and trail increment are a bit too high. So I'm going to go ahead and lower the trail, or the trail length is fine. The trail increment is too high. So I'm going to lower the trail increment and bring it closer so it's intersecting the last sphere. And I'm going to increase the length. And you can probably get the idea now, is that all this does is create this kind of makeshift motion blur, velocity blur trail effect so that it covers enough ground to cover the last substep. So we've got point velocity again to calculate velocity, and we turn it into pyro source so we can, well, source the pyro. And then we have a volume rasterize, which, well, you know what these will do at this point. Like I mentioned before, you do have the volume, the velocity blur, which for something like this actually works because it just stretches it out and makes it a bit easier to emit on. So you could take it on for a method like this, and you know the dop net is all the same as well. It's the same thing with the pyro sourcing. So you can see what that looks like on screen. It worked. It's not perfect. It's definitely not nearly as smooth as the particle way, but it's very quick to set up, and it's very easy to understand. And you don't need to emit particles or anything like that. You just need to, you know, put the trail in, make it a bit tighter on the increment, and then you're good to go. However, to get it that smooth, I did have to increase the substeps to 10, which is the maximum, not the maximum, the default max. You can go beyond 10 if you want, which makes it very slow to simulate. Because if I had it at, let's say, what we had the particle one at, I had it at 5, we can see here, it's just a little bit steppier. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's just a little bit steppier. You can see here's one step, one step, one step, one step, one step, one step, one step. It kind of looks like a spine. You can see the steps in it, and it's just not ideal. So you really have to crank the substeps up in order to smooth it out. But like I said, it's one of many ways to do it. But that's essentially it. I like to make tutorials on things that I struggled with when I started Houdini, things that were so obvious to other people, but I just couldn't seem to grasp. So I know this seems like simple stuff, but trust me, if you're watching this, you're probably one of the people, but there are people out there that could do with this kind of thing being explained to them in a simple way, because I didn't even know how to Google what I didn't know when I was new at Houdini. So fast-moving pyro simulations, they felt like they were beyond me. Everyone just says crank the substeps up, and that's just not a good blanket advice. So I thought I would do this to help. If it did help you, I would greatly appreciate a like, comment, subscribe if you'd like to see more tutorials. If you have any questions related to the tutorial or not, you can leave them down below, message me on Twitter, Instagram, or even email me. I do try and respond to all of them within reason and help you out with what I can. I appreciate you for lending me your attention for this long, and as always, take care.